Since South Africa became independent from the Brits in 1910, our politics have been dominated by nationalism, Afrikaner nationalism, and today black nationalism. And it's very important to understand the distinction between these two nationalisms. They have a difference. People think that what distinguishes them is because one is white and one is black. Actually, that's not what distinguished Afrikaner nationalism from black nationalism. What essentially distinguished these two nationalisms was that one was a nationalism led by property owners, and the other was a nationalism led by non-property owners. If we take what happened to South Africa between 1910 and 1994, where the nationalism of property owners, initially farmers, but later joined by other property owners, what their primary drive was to make their property profitable. And to make your property profitable, you have to invest. So you find that in the era of Afrikaner nationalism, you saw a huge drive towards investment and a huge drive towards underconsumption. There was an unequal distribution of the underconsumption part. Most of the underconsumption was focused on the black population. They were the ones who were forced to underconsume under the multitude of policies that were being pursued by the National Party government. What people forget is that the National Party was the government of South Africa almost for 70 years. They first got into government in 1924. So they were in power for a very long time, and they were out of power very briefly during the period of the Second World War, and then they came back in 1948. So the major power, political power for South Africa during the 20th century was actually the National Party. So you find that in those 84 years, if you wish, this is when South Africa had what I could call an industrial revolution. There was massive investment in our railway infrastructure, road infrastructure. There was the creation of the parastatals, where the private sector was not interested in investing. The state sector invested. The creation, for example, of the iron and steel industry in South Africa was created during this period with the establishment of ISCO and so on. And there are many other industries in fertilizer, in South African Broadcasting Corporation, Sasol, the armaments industry, and so on. So this was the era of what I would call the Industrial Revolution in South Africa. But what that did do was to make the property of the constituency of Afrikaner nationalism, the largest constituency being the farmers. It made their business more profitable. We had universities which were developed the skills, the extension services to support the farmers, the railway infrastructure which carried the goods of the farmers at low rates, and so on and so forth. So, but this was in a way, the high point of the Industrial Revolution in South Africa. Now, if you look at what happens after 1994, you now have a new group of nationalists, but these are not property owners. So since they don't have any property, they have no property, they cannot live off profit. And so what do? They live off state revenues. And this is the distinction between what happened before 94 in terms of the economy, what happens after 94, which is why you have a stable economic policy, because you have a policy that has to generate, an economic policy that has to generate revenue for the consumption of the new propertyless nationalists and their constituency, the black poor, who we have inherited from the Industrial Revolution, if you wish, of South Africa. This mass of poor people, of poor black people is one of the inheritance of the Industrial Revolution of South Africa. So we have two inheritances in a way from the Industrial Revolution. The massive infrastructure, the high level of industrialization of South Africa. South Africa is, as you know, the largest economy in Africa. And if you look at the position of the South African economy, it's almost exactly the same in Africa economically as the United States in the rest of the world. We have 5% of the African population, and we produce nearly 25% of Africa's GDP. The United States is about the same. It has 4.5 of the world population, but it produces, again, about 21 or so percent of the world's GDP. What are the main social groups that make up South Africa today, and how do they relate to one another? If you take the top group, which are the capitalists who came from, as I say, the Industrial Revolution, obviously their main objective is to maximize their profits and to retain private ownership of their assets. Their strength is that they own assets and they control the most skilled part of the South African population, which is the managers of the private sector. If you look at where the skills in South Africa lie and where the knowledge in South Africa lie, it actually lies with the management of the private sector. That's where your engineers, your accountants, your MBAs, and a lot of your scientists, your medical people, it's concentrated in the private sector. So that is a massive asset that the private sector is. However, there is a key weakness that the capitalists in South Africa have, which they didn't have, by the way, in the Afrikaner nationalist era. First, they do not control the government. There's been a separation between the control of the government between capital and non-owners of capital. So they no longer control the government. Secondly, they are dependent on the state for power generation and transportation. And these are very key parts, especially for an economy like South Africa, which is a very mineral-driven economy. The power generation and transportation, especially rail transportation, are in a way very critical parts of the economy. The weakness is that the owners of capital do not control this part. And the capital sector of our society has vulnerabilities. First, because they don't control the government, they are susceptible to the seizure of their assets by the state. And this is one of the major issues that has arisen in South Africa since 1994, is the fear of the capitalists of their assets being seized by the state. This has enormous consequences for South Africa. One of its major consequences is that the owners of capital, we've seen the migration of South African companies to the London Stock Exchange. And this is a manifestation of this vulnerability. Secondly, they are very exposed to onerous tax rates. Again, because they are not part of the state, they can be taxed and they have no control at what the tax rate is. And South Africa, and if you look at what has been happening to state spending, a big part of which goes to wages and salaries, especially for the top government officials, taxation is at 33% of GDP. They are also exposed to corruption, especially from, again, state officials, because the interface between business and the state is, in every country, it's an important factor. The consequence of this is that, as I have indicated, the migration to the London Stock Exchange, we have huge capital flight in South Africa. You have huge underinvestment in the mining sector because of all the threats that are sitting around the mining sector. So those are only some, there are many others, of the consequences. The second group that did not exist before 94, it exists today because of the separation of management of the state from ownership of capital, is what I call the bureaucratic bourgeoisie. And this is the group that controls the state today in South Africa. They don't own capital, but they control political power through the democratic process. So what is their primary objective? Is to maximize their own consumption, obviously, from state revenue, and to increase the consumption of the political constituencies that put them in power. And lastly, is to retain a monopoly of political power. The main strength, of course, is that they control the state and manage government revenues. Their weaknesses is their dependence on the electorate, especially on the black underclass to be elected. Now, this is a very important factor in the instability of the politics of the ANC, is the dependence on the underclass to be elected. They don't own productive assets, and they have very weak management skills. If you look at South Africa today, the comparison between management skills in the public sector and the private sector is so stark. We're having demonstration after demonstration after demonstration about service delivery. What does this reflect? It actually reflects failure of management in the public sector. Although the public sector politicians pay themselves these phenomenal salaries that are more or less equivalent to what are paid to private sector management, they don't have the management skills that the private sector managers have. And this is part of the dynamics of our situation. Now, the biggest vulnerability of this group is the change of allegiance by the underclass. And this is one of the key instabilities of South Africa, because what you are seeing the DA doing, it's starting to get into that particular group, especially if you look at Cape Town, is beginning to have a dialogue with that group, and that's a major threat to the ANC in particular. The third social group in this country, which has enormous amount of power, is organized labor. I haven't separated organized labor from the formal sector workers in general, because we have such high levels of unionization in the country that organized labor is almost synonymous with formal sector workers. I think I read somewhere that 53% of South African formal sector blue-collar workers are unionized. So this is a very important category. Now, its objective is obviously to expand its membership, because that's where it gets its power from, and to raise remuneration for its members. It owns and controls the independent unions that are its strength. However, it is threatened by this huge overhang of unemployed people. Now, one of its vulnerabilities is mismanagement of the economy, because when the economy is mismanaged, they lose their jobs. Corruption is a huge vulnerability to organized labor. Organized labor is very nervous about losing influence over the government through this instability of the ANC. The alliance is becoming more and more unstable itself, and this is very problematic for organized labor. Then we have one of the most important social groups, ironically, in this country. Why it is important is because it's the single largest social formation in South Africa, which is the black underclass. The University of Cape Town estimates that between 55% and 75% of the black population live in poverty. And if you look at our labor absorption of the adult population in South Africa, we only absorb 40% of our adult population of working age. The others are not absorbed in the economy. So we have a massive underclass in this country. It has always been there. It was in the form of the Industrial Revolution of South Africa. But the difference is that today it has a vote. Before, it didn't have any political power. Today, it has the vote, and this is the vote on which the ANC in particular depends to stay in power. Now, this has numerous consequences for the stability and instability of the ANC. This partly explains the rise of demagogy in the ANC, because this is an undereducated population which is hugely dependent on state welfare. And so for their allegiance to keep their allegiance, the ANC leadership is resorting more and more to demagogy because of the internal instability of the ANC itself. That is the message that it is giving to this particular population. However, one of the interesting things about the underclass and its dependence on state revenue and on state social grants is that it has a vested interest in a stable economy. It has a vested interest in inflation being kept low, because if we have high inflation, your social grant is worthless because it will buy nothing. So the irony about the stability of the South African economy is not just the ANC itself and the middle class in the ANC, or even business, big business, but it is also the underclass that wants a stable economy. So one of the interesting things then is the relationship between organized labor and the underclass. Organized labor, for example, is in favor of a weak currency, of a weak exchange rate between the South African rand and the dollar. If you weaken the currency, then the imports become expensive. And as we will see, our productive capacity in South Africa is declining. And we are living more and more on imported goods. If our exchange rates start to depreciate significantly, then these become more expensive. So in an interesting way, this is one of the major contributors to the stability of the economic policy of the ANC. If I can try and summarize who the ANC's constituencies are, what they receive and what they give. The biggest constituencies, as I've said, are the black poor who vote for the ANC. What they receive is welfare, social grants, and a whole multitude, the planned national health insurance, and so on, if it ever materializes. What do they give? They vote for the ANC. The second constituency are the black political elite and the black middle class, who receive affirmative action and black economic empowerment. In return, they manage the state, or mismanage the state, as the case may be. And then there is an important constituency which is made up of big business and the multinationals who receive the economic policies that I have alluded to, and friendly labor and environmental laws. It's interesting, in South Africa, a great deal of noise gets made about our labor laws in South Africa being one thing or the other. Actually, the labor laws of South Africa are not quite as what the unions want them to be. Of course, the irony of it is that a huge part of the labor laws of South Africa came from the negotiation between the unions and the National Party. The heart of South Africa's labor law is the Labor Relations Act, which was negotiated between the unions and the black unions in particular, and the National Party and big business. What gets forgotten is that the VN Commission, which in many ways drove the agenda of the big corporations in this country, was formulated the heart of what is today the labor relations laws of South Africa. You have a lot of laws on the edges but they are not in the same way. Now, what do these constituencies get? They get these stable Washington consensus policies and these friendly laws, and of course they produce our exports and they manage our financial sector. Now, who is left out of this? Ironically, the constituencies who are left out are organized labor, the local entrepreneurs, the white middle class, commercial farmers, independent professionals, and civil societies generally. Now, this group that is left out, they are in a way the last in the queue if there's anything to be given. Lastly, before 1994, we had the nationalism of the National Party or of the Afrikaners was driving an industrial revolution. What we are seeing with the black nationalism is the driving of the consumer revolution.